Today we're going to cover a lot of things, so this is a brief overview of what we're going to be doing. First, I'll briefly just introduce our speakers today and then update you on what's happening with our budget right now. We have a wonderful guest speaker today, Miss Virginia Ainslie. She will be giving you the lowdown on the budget and appropriations process. And then we have a couple of our AGU staff here, Brittany, Webster, and Carissa Bunge, who will talk to you about what is AGU doing and how you can engage in that process. So who are we? So my name is Timia. I'm the Public Affairs Analyst here at AGU. I'm also joined by my colleagues Brittany Webster and Carissa Bunge. They both work in the AGU Public Affairs Department as well. We basically work to advocate for you as scientists, the scientific community, and for support for science. We also have a really amazing special guest speaker that I'm excited to introduce you to. This is Jenny Ainslie. She's here to talk about the budget and appropriations process. She's the CEO of Ainslie & Associates and has more than 30 years of experience working with Congress on policy and funding issues, including research priorities. She currently teaches politics of the federal budget at George Washington University, Graduate School of Political Management, and Ms. Ainslie has a BS in chemistry and dual degree in political science from Michigan State University. So we're very happy to have you, Jenny. Thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
So let's first start off by talking about what's happening right now. So currently we're in fiscal year 2017, and we are under what's called a continuing resolution, or CR, meaning that Congress has kept the same spending levels for a short-term spending bill. Continuing resolutions that we're currently under will fund the government through April 28th, which at some point Congress needs to then pass a new spending bill in order to make sure that the government is funded. So CRs are not the best thing for us in science. It leaves a lot of uncertainty for federal science agencies. It also stops new programs from happening. So we'd really like to see a more long-term funding solution there. Another thing that's really interesting about the budget climate that we're in now is the fact that Congress failed to pass their fiscal year 17 budget. Which means that we're in an unusual situation where we're dealing with two budgets in 1 year, both fiscal year 17 and fiscal year 2018. And because of that, and the fact that we have a lot of political alignment here, where Republicans control the House, Senate, and the White House, where Republicans are trying to use those two budget opportunities to then do something called reconciliation, which we'll hear more about from Jenny a little later on. But keep that in mind. We're under a CR, and we're in an unusual situation where we might have two budgets this year. So let's talk about the budget and federal spending. What is that? So federal spending is basically split up into two categories. We have mandatory spending, which includes things like Medicare and Social Security, and is also known as entitlement spending. This is the part of the budget. Mandatory spending is part of the budget that is determined by eligibility. So it's like automatic spending that we have to do. And it's not controlled by the appropriations process, so that's important to know. But on the other side, we have discretionary spending, which is about 1/3 of total spending. And that's really steered by appropriations. And it includes science and research funding, which I know we all care about. Of the total federal spending, science only accounts for about 1%. So really keep that in mind when we start talking about the challenges of balancing a budget and potential cuts to science that are being used to kind of make up for that spending elsewhere. If we look a little deeper into discretionary spending, we can further break that down into defense spending and non-defense discretionary spending, or NDD. So this discretionary funding makes up about 1/3 of total spending, and then it is further broken down into this defense and non-defense categories. So even though research is funded through both of these pots of money, it's really non-defense discretionary funding, or NDD, where we traditionally think of as our sources for research funding for things like NOAA, NSF, and NASA. So it's very important for us to really ensure that the amount of money that's going into this pot is robust, because it directly affects the spending in science agencies that we really care about. So if we look at the trends for federal spending since 2010, what you will notice is that spending has been going down a little bit, unfortunately. We haven't really gone back up to those 2010 levels. And so one thing to just note here is that it's not as if science has been as robustly funded as it has been in 2010, or fiscal year 2010. You know, it's been a little lean these past few years. And that is really important for you to understand as we move into what's happening now with budget proposals and proposed spending. So the president's budget is supposed to come out next week. March 16th is the target date for him to release these official numbers on what he proposes we should be setting our numbers at for these federal science agencies. And preliminary reports are saying that he is going to propose some significant cuts to science agencies. These numbers are by no means the end-all be-all numbers or the official numbers, but some of the reports that came out in the news, this is kind of what it seems like we might be looking at in the president's budget. So this is even more of a cut than what we've been seeing since 2010, and it looks pretty grim, I must say. But I just want to give everybody a little hope that this is the president's budget, this is what he proposes the numbers should be, but this is not the end-all be-all. Congress has to still approve a budget, and so it really is an opportunity for us to engage with our champions and people who may not know all the important value of science. And I think it's really important for us to really understand what this means for science. So we say that we have budget cuts, but how is this really going to affect the scientific agencies, scientists, or the science that we're doing now? So as I said, we've been under funding constraints for a while now, and we're looking at even more cuts. One stat that I like a lot that's on this slide is that NSF's budget has decreased by $250 million. And that really struck me because I always think about what could we have funded with that $250 million, and if there's another $250 million cut, what programs would that affect now? And this is especially telling when you think about how 90% of the money that goes to NSF goes out the door to science and basically funds these amazing science programs that really have great benefits for society. So I don't want to leave you on a negative note before we switch over to our guest speaker, so I will just say this and leave you with one thought. The federal funding process, in many respects, is about who speaks the loudest. And we have an opportunity here to really engage many of our champions and members of Congress about the value of science and how these cuts could hurt science and then, by extension, society. So we should really be out there engaging in this process and informing legislators that science is valuable, it is essential, and it is something that affects our national security, our economy, and our public health. And on that note, I will leave it to Jenny to explain to you more about how the budget process works and give you some more context about our timeline and what we will be facing.
There are three types of legislation Congress considers. The first kind is authorization. That explains who is going to do it, what the government's going to do, and it also specifies how it will be paid for. This includes tax legislation. It authorizes appropriations, but it does not in itself allow money to be spent on the program. That doesn't happen until an appropriations bill. Appropriations is just another word for spending bills, and appropriations are the only kind of legislation Congress must pass every year, otherwise government shuts down. In 1974, in an attempt to oppose some order and discipline on federal spending, Congress passed the Congressional Budget Act. And this imposed a budget process on top of existing powerful committee structures. And that's one reason why it is often implemented in an awkward way. Its enforcement is sometimes inconsistent. On the other hand, the budget resolution and budget reconciliation bills have a special procedural advantage. They are allowed to pass the Senate with no filibuster, no cloture, and only 51 votes. For that reason, budget reconciliation bills are often used as a way to try and pass controversial legislation. This is how the federal budget process should work, at least in theory. And the first part is when OMB releases the president's budget. The president's budget basically indicates what he wants to do and how he wants to do it. It's his statement of how he will implement his campaign promises. It must comply with current law or explicitly state how laws must be changed to do what he wants to do. A OMB presidential budget can be very effective in getting Congress to pass bills if the White House, the Senate, and the House are aligned in some kind of agreement. That is definitely not the case today, even though we have a partisan alignment. The second step is the budget committees, and they have to put together what's called a budget resolution, which is just an agreement that sets the discretionary caps for defense and non-defense spending for a given fiscal year. In step 3, the Appropriations Committee takes that defense amount and that non-defense amount and distributes that funding among its 12 appropriations subcommittees in what's known as the 302B process. It's important to understand that as long as there is downward pressure on non-defense discretionary spending, it gets harder and harder for us to claim a fair share of that part of the discretionary budget. Remember, we're up against all the social safety net programs, we're up against infrastructure, we're up against homeland security. 4, 5, and 6 are just the appropriations process that then follows through after the 302B allocations are made. A little bit about the two components of the congressional budget process. The first is a budget resolution. It is just a fiscal agreement between the House and Senate. They have to pass the same version, but it is not a law. It is not signed by the President, and it only sometimes includes reconciliation instructions. Reconciliation instructions are basically instructions to those powerful authorizing committees, and it gives them targets for savings amounts. It does not tell them how to achieve those savings. It only gives them an amount and a deadline for preparing legislation that needs to be sent back to the Budget Committee. Again, the budget resolution is protected in both the House and Senate, and therefore needs only 51 votes to pass in the Senate, with no filibusters and no cloture. If the budget resolution includes reconciliation instructions, then basically the authorizing committees have to prepare their version of how the law should be changed to accomplish the kinds of savings required by the budget resolution. They don't always make those targets. Sometimes they don't even prepare legislation. But once they do, those bills are sent to the Budget Committee, and the Budget Committee has no jurisdiction over changing them. All they can do is basically stable them together, takes them to the Speaker, and it goes to the floor. The Budget Committee has very limited ability to change what the authorizing committees propose. The budget resolution, as we said, is just an agreement. It provides top-line numbers for discretionary spending. Technically, it provides a top-line number also for mandatory spending, but that's just a guess. Entitlement programs sometimes cost much more than budgeteers think they will. Anyone who is entitled and meets the criteria gets mandatory spending, so it's just mentioned there, and it's often used as a justification for budget reconciliation instructions. But a budget resolution provides a fiscal framework for Congress for all other kinds of bills, not just appropriations, but also authorizing bills. And a lot of people don't appreciate that, say, a NSF reauthorization bill is also limited by what's in the budget resolution. So it's basically the budget resolution that sets the limit on spending for discretionary programs, including science. This is a look at what our FY18 legislative calendar looks like. Technically, the President's budget from OMB was due the first Monday in February. It's not unusual for that to be much delayed in a President's very first year. We are expecting it. It was announced it would be released next March 16th. That may be moved up to the 15th. And it would be moved up to the 15th, so it coincides with when technically the debt ceiling expires. And they will use the cuts in the President's budget, and they will justify them using the fact that they're going to have to raise the debt ceiling, which is always a tough vote, especially for Republicans in both the House and Senate. Theoretically, by April 15th, the Congress should pass a conferenced or compromised version of its budget resolution for FY18. That may be delayed a bit, seeing as we got a late start on the President's budget. But remember, by April 28th, our current continuing resolution for FY17 expires. So Congress is going to have to finish up the spending bills for 17 before it really begins seriously working on the FY18 appropriations. They have between April 15th and September 30th to complete those.
So now I'm going to kick it over to Brittany Webster, and she's going to talk to you a little bit about what AGU is doing and how you can help us with this.
Thanks, Timia. So I'm just going to highlight some of the things AGU is doing to ensure that science is at the forefront of policy decision makers' minds when negotiating the budget. So for a couple of years now, AGU has been involved with the Non-Defense Discretionary, or NDD United Coalition. NDD United, it's an alliance of hundreds of national, state, and local organizations working to protect investments in core government functions that benefit Americans. So the programs included in this include everything from Veterans Affairs, medical and scientific research, education and job training, infrastructure, weather monitoring and environmental protection, natural and cultural resources, housing and social services, basically everything except defense. So by uniting with other organizations that receive funding under the NDD side of the budget, AGU is really able to have a stronger voice when advocating for a larger slice of the pie, and therefore science funding. AGU is also proactively engaging Congress about the importance and value of Earth and space science. One major way we're doing that is through the Earth and Space Science Caucus in the House of Representatives. Last week, we held our first event of the year, which was a briefing entitled Earth and Space Science 101, Securing the Nation and Expanding Frontiers. And for those of you who aren't familiar, briefings are an opportunity for members of Congress and their staff to learn more about a particular topic in a fun and engaging way. And so our briefing featured speakers on critical minerals, GOES-R, and exoplanets. So through the caucus and other measures this year, AGU will continue to share with members of Congress facts, stories, and examples about the importance of Earth and space science funding. And you can actually check out a recap of the briefing on Store 5. And finally, we're also creating opportunities for our members to engage on these important issues. And by participating in one of our engagements to meet with, write, or call your legislators, AGU members can really help to amplify AGU's voice in DC. So how can you engage? First off, I want to preface this by saying that this is by no means an exhaustive list of how you can engage on the federal budget process and talk about the importance of science to your lawmakers. These are simply some highlights, and Carissa later on will go into some other examples. So first, you can write a letter to your congressman talking about the importance of science through our Policy Action Center. We're constantly updating the Action Center with new engagements and campaigns, so I encourage you to check out the page often. You can also consider going to meet your member of Congress during April recess. The weeks of April 10th and April 17th, kind of around that Easter holiday, members of Congress will be back in their districts. During this time, I urge you to consider scheduling a meeting with your member, attending a town hall or a small coffee or office hour, and talking to your member about your concerns regarding how tight the federal budget is and how it could potentially negatively affect funding for science. And don't forget to also discuss how science benefits your community, whether it's your local university, educational opportunities for underserved students, or simply protecting the local river. These are all values your science brings to your community. And finally, on our policy action page, you can also share how your career in science has been shaped or aided by federal funding, or how federal funding for science is helping your community right now. And AGU can really use these stories on the Hill when talking with members about the importance of science in their district or state.
Awesome. Thank you, Brittany. Now let's go back to Jenny, and she's going to talk to you more about the appropriations process. So we've talked about the budget. Now let's talk about spending.
Right now, this is a slide of what the appropriations process looks like. It's much more straightforward than the budget process. And if you see the Capitol building down there where it says Joint Senate and House Conference work out differences between the two bills, that's where we are right now on the FY17 spending bills. They are in the process of passing a modification to the defense spending bill for 2017, and that literally abides by the caps that were in last year's budget resolution. We are expecting a supplemental defense request from the White House, which would add additional defense spending in FY17. I think those will probably be passed separately in the House, but they might be combined in the Senate. A lot of senators don't want to increase defense unless non-defense is also increased. We have had that agreement since the Budget Control Act of 2011. That is going to be a tough fight. We're hoping we win it. If we don't, then increases for defense are very likely to happen again in FY18 and to be partially paid for by offsets from the non-defense side of the budget. That budget that's scheduled to come out next week is going to be a nightmare. Not only is it going to pay for increased defense spending by cutting non-defense programs, including science, it is going to pay for the new wall by, at least based on what we've heard, cutting the Coast Guard, TSA, and FEMA, which doesn't make much sense, but that's the plan. We are going to see a very agitated debate on this in both the House and Senate. In the House, whoever has the most votes wins. Budget points of order are often waived, but we will have a much more contentious debate in the Senate. What we are asking you to focus on is the FY 2018 appropriations process. That's the one where the budget comes out next week. They start markups in April or May, and where they have to finish by September, especially if defense gets a huge increase at the expense of non-defense. We will have perhaps the hardest fight for science we've seen in the last 20 years. This is the legislative calendar for this calendar year, and it just shows you when Congress is here in Washington and when it's back in the district and the state. And the best time to meet with your members and senators is when they're back in the district or state. They have more time. That's one of the reasons they're supposed to be back home, is to listen to you. We are also organizing some visits to the Hill here in Washington, but we do urge you strongly to meet with your member. And not just once, but keep going back until they understand how important it is to you, and they understand that all the scientists in their district or state are watching.
Thank you, Jenny. Now we're going to pass it over to Carissa, who's going to again tell you what AGU is doing about this process and how you guys can help us do that.
Thanks, Timia. So I'm going to discuss a few of the things AGU is doing to make sure that funding for science is a priority for appropriators in Congress. AGU regularly engages with Hill offices by meeting with staff, sending letters in support of science funding, and educating offices about the value of science to their districts, states, and the nation. And as Brittany mentioned before, a big part of this educating process is through our caucus and through briefings like the one we had and we will continue to have throughout the year. We also build and engage with coalitions, typically amongst AGU and other scientific societies and institutions. And really we come together around shared values in science. And so for pretty much any issue that you might think of, whether it's funding or policy writers, there are coalitions that are focused on those issues. And then we also work to facilitate visits from constituents to let legislators know the value of science. So those might be in DC through Congressional visit fly-in days, or in the district we can help you out with scheduling your visits. So what can you do to support strong science appropriations? If you go to AGU's Science Policy website, you can sign up for AGU's Science Policy Alerts. And these will help you stay up to date on current policy issues, get the latest news, and also give you an opportunity to be engaged. Like Brittany mentioned, we send out those engagements as issues come up. So that's a great way to stay plugged in. We also encourage you to share your science with your policymaker and really talk about why science is essential. So in the current funding environment, it's up to us to make the case for science. You can call, write, tweet, or meet with your legislator and make your voice heard. If you don't know where to start, AGU has created science policy toolkits to prepare you to engage. So we have a few from social media to how to request a meeting with your member, to how to write a letter. So you can check out our toolkits at our Science Policy website, which is linked here, and we will be also sending that out after the webinar.
So that is basically the end of our prepared slides, and we definitely want to open up to questions. So if you have any questions, we really encourage you to insert them into the question toolbar, and we'd be happy to answer them. We have quite a bit of time to address all the questions you have.
I would like to point out that what happens to science funding in FY 2018 could determine the direction for science funding for the next 20 years. In the budget process, whatever you get in one year is used as the baseline for what you get the next. In other words, if we lose funding in 2018, we start there and go down from there in FY 19. That's why this request for your action is so urgent.
Well, I'm not seeing any questions. So until then, we have a couple other things that we kind of wanted to remind you of, and I'll do in the meantime while you're thinking about your questions. One thing that we just want to make sure that you know, we've talked about a lot of ways you can engage. We've talked about some political policy processes that are going to happen later in the year, but we want you to know that there's ways that you can engage right now and help talk about why science is so valuable and help us to get some robust funding. A couple of things that you can do is sign up for science policy alerts, as Carissa and Brittany mentioned. They're a really good way for us to give you information about what's happening currently in policy on the Hill so that you can take action with us. Follow us on Twitter, where we give tidbits about what's going on in Congress. We also have toolkits, and these are really meant to give you the resources and tools that you need to engage with your policymaker, whether or not you have 5 minutes or you have a whole day to dedicate to this. We always encourage people to write their legislator. We have an action center, actioncenter.ugu.org, and there you can write your legislator through our system, and it will be sent to the person who represents you. And that's your opportunity to talk about why science is so valuable, how it's helped your community, and how funding science is really important. We also suggest that you sign up for the Sharing Science Network. This is a really great network to give you tools and resources about how you can share your science effectively to a non-science audience. And also just generally share your experience with us. As Brittany mentioned, it would be really great to have your stories about how science funding cuts have affected you or how science has been critical for your community. Those are really stories that we can use on the Hill.
So we actually have a couple of questions, and I want to start with the one that regards FY17 funding. So how likely is it that the NSF FY17 budget gets reduced when the FY17 CR is voted on? Judy, I don't know if you want to respond first.
I think NSF will get about the same amount of money that it gets in the CR. It might get a little bit more if they decide to use the appropriations bills the committees worked out last year. Those give us a little bit money for most of the science programs than we got in FY16. A CR at this point is probably not as good an outcome as if they use the bills they've worked out in conference. We don't know which way they will go yet, whether they will just do a CR. They might do that because they're running out of time. They have so much to do this year that if it looks like, especially in the Senate, this could get bogged down fighting about FY17 appropriations, they will default to a CR.
Another question that we saw was asking if inviting a member of Congress to do field work with you would be a good way to get to know them. And actually, we encourage scientists to have members come visit them at their institution or your research center to kind of show them that hands-on experience of what you do. So no, that is not a crazy or weird idea.
I like that idea. If they claim they don't have time to do it, by all means, bring in some video or some pictures of your field work. The more you can involve them in the hands-on work you do and explain to them why it's important and why it's one of the highest return on taxpayer investments there is, the better.
So we have a question, and I know when we have fly-ins, I think some people are concerned when they only go to offices and they're like, we're on your side. But the question is, I live in a state with all Democratic members of Congress. How can I best engage to support science funding? So before I turn to everyone else in the room, I'll say one thing. I think it's always, though, important to check in with those offices and still kind of be constantly telling them like maybe what's new, but also kind of re-emphasizing to them that science should be a priority for them. And I would also say that I think start asking them for some concrete demonstrations of their support for science. It could be something from just giving a floor speech to maybe tweeting on a certain day about science, maybe I'm just going to say Earth Day, but start asking for some concrete steps, because I think hardly ever do we walk into an office and they say they don't support science, but I think that means different things to different people. So having a concrete ask and asking them to do things that like kind of publicly demonstrates their support for science is one way that I think we try to challenge our champions and supporters to be more vocal.
I think in addition to that, it's very important for you to talk to your member of Congress, even if you know that they're supportive of science. It may be that you have some information about new science that's out there, or a really cool fact about how the science in your community, or your science is helping your community. And that's things that they can use and talk about how science is very valuable for society. So even if you're going in and you're also asking them for ways to demonstrate their support, you also have an opportunity to really be a resource and give them the information that you have that maybe they don't have because they're not in the lab with you doing your science.
That's a good summary of the 3 things I like to reinforce when you visit a friendly member. First of all, thank them. This is not a friendly environment. It gets very discouraging to get outvoted, especially in the House, over and over and over. A sincere thank you goes a long way. Second of all, give them ammunition. They are the ones that have to fight with you against some very tough, very well-informed opposition. Any data you have, any case studies you have, your own story about what it means in their district or state can help them fight effectively for our side. And third, often to be a resource for them. If a question comes up on science funding that they can't answer, encourage them to call you. And if you can't answer it, offer to find someone who can. We'll be happy to help you with that. Encourage your member to get in the habit of using you as a resource and a friend on science issues.
There was a very similar question to that about if you do live in a heavily Democratic state, a productive way to reach out to Congress beyond your own rep. Maybe you border a Republican district and you have another scientist that lives in that district. You could pair up and go to offices and do visits with them. That's a way that you could kind of reach out beyond your own district.
And something that we say here at AGU when we're talking to people about meeting the member of Congress, it's always good to have an extra person with you just to help with the conversation. So that might be a good way to collaborate, meet more members of Congress, and also make your visit just a little easier.
Yeah, so there's a question here, limits to political engagement from federal employees. So if you're a federal employee, you can always talk about your science and the value of your science, but you cannot ask specifically for a specific funding level or funding increase for your agency. And so a lot of times this is where taking another scientist who is not a government employee can be helpful because they can make a specific dollar amount ask, but also to, if you're in town, AGU staff is also always happy to play that role as well.
And you could come up with an ask that's not funding related, like joining the House Earth and Space Science Caucus.
If you have friends that live in states or districts that have Republican representatives or senators, encourage them to do the meetings. Keep on them. Make sure they don't let this one go by.
One question I'm seeing is how to engage in, I guess, getting your member to understand the value of science for those who might be, quote, against science. I think this is a really good question. I think that sometimes it feels like maybe your member of Congress might be against science, but I also think this is an opportunity. You know, do a little research about your member of Congress. Maybe they're really into national security. So making that tie to how science research helps us protect our borders or ensure that communities are resilient. Those are the type of things and type of ties that can really resonate with members of Congress that you may traditionally think don't care about science. They just might need a little connection to some of their priorities. You know, meet them where they are.
Science has helped the U.S. win every war it's ever fought. Don't let them forget that.
And if all else fails, you can talk about the economic value of science, especially if you work in the lab and say you employ grad students. That's always a really great thing to bring up.
And I will say one other thing is, if you have a meeting and you feel like, I don't know if he actually got it or she actually got it, don't give up. I mean, really, to make a difference, it's about building those relationships. And so making sure that you are coming at them not in an aggressive way, just being a resource for them, trying to open a conversation with them, talk about things that are concerning you, make ties to things that you know that they care about, and then follow up and build that connection. They will see that you're trying to be nonpartisan, trying to support their efforts, and they'll really appreciate that.
The biggest secret of effective advocacy on the Hill is persistence. Polite, consistent persistence. And remember, you will often be dealing with staff. That's fine. But sometimes staff gets changed or transferred to a different office or a different topic. You may run through 3 or 4 different staffers in a given office on your issue. Make sure you always know who is handling your issue in that office and that you contact them regularly without being a pest, and let them know you're not going away and that you appreciate all their hard work on your behalf.
So we have a question about, you said AGU can help schedule visits. Can you also provide help to plan what we should say and how to be most effective? Yes, so this year we're definitely making more of an effort for when our members come to town to DC, either just to visit with their members of Congress or as part of, I guess, another work-related trip. We're making an effort to help them plan and kind of coordinate visits on the Hill. And we definitely help you and actually prefer if you'll work with us on your messaging about how to kind of best talk about your science in a way that's really going to resonate with your policymakers. And, you know, depending on whether you've done visits or not, depends on how much coaching we give you. But that's definitely something we can help with.
We'd be glad to help coach you, and if you like, we can pretend to be a hostile member of Congress and walk you through the worst thing you could possibly encounter, and after that I'm sure you'll feel more comfortable with how it really goes down. Remember that science funding pays for itself many times over. There are a lot of things that taxpayer money goes to for which that's not true. So science is one of the best investments that a taxpayer can make and that Congress can make, and it pays off long term.
So the next question we have is kind of about that pie chart we showed you, you know, the wedges, I guess, of non-defense discretionary kind of versus defense discretionary, and kind of how can we ensure that non-defense discretionary money, kind of those recipients aren't pitted against each other. And Chairman Culberson, who's the chairman of the House Commerce, Justice, Science Appropriations Bill, actually kind of had a piece last week in Science about the March on Science, and one of the things he said that scientists need to talk more about kind of larger budget issues, which we've presented today. And so the best way really to ensure that kind of that NDD size of the pie is larger is, unfortunately, it's about kind of driving down the mandatory parts of the budget. And so that's a kind of a larger budget reform question, but that is something that I think organizations like AGU and other NDD groups are getting more engaged on, because we realize that that size of the pie is just getting smaller.
One of the reasons Congress is so concerned and is putting so much effort into cutting discretionary funding of both defense and non-defense is because of the size of the national debt, which is approaching $20 trillion. That is a real concern. On the other hand, cutting science to help pay for that is like cutting your kid's allowance to pay the mortgage. It's such a small amount, and it hurts the U.S. long term. It makes it harder to pay down that debt, not easier.
One of the questions that we have is whether or not NASA and NASA Earth Science, hearing that NASA and NASA Earth Science might be fine, but that the chart suggested otherwise, and how to balance those. One thing I will say, I think this is referring to the slide with the president's budget and how it looks like maybe some of those programs will not be fine. Those are reports on the president's budget. And even if the president's budget does come out and makes those massive cuts, Congress is still involved in this process. So it's not as if the president's budget comes out and that is the end-all be-all. So this is what we were talking about in terms of being engaged in this process. This is our time to really speak up and say, those numbers are really going to be devastating for science. And there are many members, both Democrats and Republicans, that want to hear about that, that are concerned about science, and will be our champions for that.
On the NASA budget, we are hearing that they are likely to cut NASA Earth more than NASA Space. There is a lot of support in Congress for NASA Space programs. There is some concern that NASA Earth programs relate to climate change, and I suspect that's the justification they will use for cutting that program. We need to explain how important that data is, not because it's about climate change, but because it's incredibly important to all sectors of commerce. 72% of U.S. companies are directly impacted by the weather, for instance. So there's a lot of data that comes out of the Earth part of the NASA portfolio, which is very important and doesn't necessarily relate to climate change.
So the next question is kind of who dictates, who allocates NASA's total budget. That's really, I will say, NASA Earth Science is very, very unlikely to get like zeroed out as an account. There's just too many, NASA Earth Science is just too big for that to happen. But I think what we could see happen is, I think, big cuts to NASA Earth Science in relation to other science missions and just other NASA programs in general. And the administrator does, to some degree, have a say over NASA's budget, but I would say the final authority for a lot of appropriations positions really does lie in Congress, because there are a lot of members of Congress who have NASA or NASA Earth Science related projects in their district. So I think when talking about NASA Earth Science, the people to talk to and kind of demonstrate the importance of NASA Earth Science really should be Congress, because we saw this for several years in President Obama's budget. The budget came to Congress, and Congress was immediately like, we don't like these priorities. And I think on both sides of the aisle, that's going to be the case as well for the current president's budget as well. So I think when thinking about these kind of spending decisions, I would say Congress should be a priority.
I think it's important to remember that we need to fight for all of NASA. One of the things budget cutters like to do is give you a small cap and let you fight it out between Earth programs and space programs. We shouldn't get ourselves into that box. We need to support both of them. The total needs to be high enough to assure we're making advances in both. And a lot of the future will depend on what happens in space. We have leadership in space now that is not guaranteed for the future. Europe, China, the Russians, all of them are making great headway. And sometimes they're making it with scientists they basically stole from the U.S. because we're not getting the funding for NASA that we thought we needed in the past 10 years. So don't fall into the trap of letting them make you choose between one kind of NASA science and another. Both are very important.
Yeah, and I'll just mention too that, I mean, NASA Earth Science, but also too kind of all of the sciences we cover here at AGU, we, through the caucus, is one of the big ways we're doing this, but also through a lot of our coalition partners. We're partnering with industry, lots of universities, because every member of Congress is loyal to a university or school back in their district. And we're really trying to capitalize even on, I would say, maybe we're trying to think about what industries are really important to a lot of our congressional supporters, whether that's agriculture, fishermen, insurers, and trying to think of creative ways to get involved with them so that it's not just the scientists talking about how important these programs are, but also the people who use these sciences every day in their, as part of their business model.
And to Brittany's point, I think it's a lot about messengers, which include you as scientists. We need you as messengers, but also messages. Wow.
Mm-hmm.
A lot of things that we try to do is frame the value of science into key messages that resonate with many members of Congress. That would be the economy that's been mentioned, national security, public health and vitality. You know, there are a lot of members of Congress who have had issues with coastal flooding. That has affected their constituents. their constituents have complained to them about that. And so now it's something that they care about, and they're signing on to bills that affect or will improve that for their constituents. So it's really important to think about what some of these values are and kind of meet these members of Congress where they are, because they could really be champions for us if we just reached out to them in a way that was effective.
If you have a member or a senator who is very hostile about climate change, you might remind them that at this point, the Pentagon is the strongest proponent of climate change research. Every branch of the military has a huge investment in what happens with the climate. It is listed as one of the top threats to national security. If you can turn the conversation to national security and climate change, you might have a bit better outcome.
Another question that we have is about doing workshops on campuses for graduate students and faculty to refine their science policy communication strategies for engaging with members of Congress. Currently, we don't have a just science policy communication workshop that we take to campuses. We do try to provide a lot of resources, including these webinars, to help. We do have Congressional Visits Days and other workshops here in DC, where we train people and take them to the Hill. That application actually is opening pretty soon. And then the other thing that I will mention is that Sharing Science is a program that we have here at AGU. They are focused on helping you share your science, not just to policymakers, though, but to a lot of lay communities. This would be the media, it would be policymakers, it would just be people that may not have a science background in your community. And they really work on helping you to hone those skills so that you can be prepared. And all of those skills do transfer to speaking to your member of Congress. So if you're interested in that, I would definitely check out our Sharing Science network. I think it's sharingscience.agu.org, and you can find more information about that.
And Sharing Science also does a whole suite of workshops and events at fall meeting as well.
Actually, they have a webinar in 2 weeks about sharing your science to the media. So we will send you some information about that as well when we send out our follow-up email.
And just to clarify here an earlier point about kind of changing the proportion of defense versus non-defense discretionary funding, I think in general, I mean, looking back at the slide, if I'm not mistaken, the defense plus NDD side of the budget is actually pretty small in relation to the mandatory side of the budget. So most budget conversations that kind of talk about increasing NDD funding, it's normally more about entitlement reform, so kind of reforming Social Security and Medicare, but also to reforming taxes, which is something that the Republicans have indicated they would like to make, that's on the agenda for this year. So I think those are really the opportunities. I don't know, I think on the Hill, I think decreasing defense spending is not really a winning argument, but I think talking about how we can just increase that overall pie is a better argument.
That's a great point. If you're a member or senator suggests that, well, that's a good idea for science, but how would you pay for it? The best, strongest answer you can probably give them is that they need to do entitlement reform. Only if we get entitlement reform will we ever get out of this box where discretionary funding gets smaller and tighter every year.
We might have time for one more question. I think we might have covered all the questions then. I guess I would say that if you do have more questions about the budget, feel free to email us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. We'd be happy to follow up with the answers to your question and forward them to Ginny as well, who has kindly offered to answer any questions about the budget that you might have after the fact. So that's definitely a great avenue if you think of something after. Before we let everyone go, we just want to let you know about some of our future webinars. We're doing a whole series, this is the second one, about advocating for yourself and your science. So we'll be having some webinars coming up relatively soon about how to communicate your science and giving you an update on science policy and landscape and legislation. So please check back with us. We will be sending out emails in our science policy alert telling you when our webinars are scheduled for. So we definitely encourage you to sign up there to get more information about that. Thank you everyone for joining us today. We hope that this was super helpful for you. Again, feel free to reach out to us at sciencepolicy@agu.org. And thank you to Jenny for coming out and speaking on the budget appropriations process. I thought it was very informative. Thanks, guys.
Bye.